in last night's rally. Can you clarify, you have called the affordability crisis as a Democratic hoax, but you also want to make America affordable again.
No,
Can you just clarify?
The word that they use is a hoax, and because they're the ones that caused the problem. I'm talking about when you're trying to say it a different way. That's pretty simple, though, if you listen. It's a hoax where they created the problem. They're the ones that gave the high prices. So when they use the word affordability, they shouldn't be using that word because they're the ones that created this problem. They created the highest inflation in history, and they created the highest prices in history. And now we have to get those things down. But they look and they say affordability. They never discuss it. They just say the election's about affordability. Well, it may very well be. I think it's also about still the border. You have to remember.
You watched him say it, and here we are confronting the linguistic gymnastics of a man who exists in the rhetorical space between malicious intent and absolute incomprehensibility, because what you just witnessed is the precise architecture of authoritarian gaslighting deployed in real time against people who are struggling to afford their own lives. Trump literally called affordability concerns a hoax at this Pennsylvania rally before admitting he'd been advised not to use that word because it would be misconstrued, which is itself the most perfectly distilled crystallization of his entire political strategy, a confession embedded inside a denial, embedded inside an accusation, the semantic equivalent of telling someone their pain doesn't exist, while simultaneously claiming credit for alleviating it. And this matters because 76% of respondents in recent polling rated national economic conditions as either not so good or poor, while 62% disapprove of Trump's handling of the economy, and yet here he stands at a casino in Mount Pocono, constructing an alternate reality where the very word affordability is somehow a democratic invention, a linguistic trap designed to ensnare him rather than a descriptor of the material conditions crushing millions of American families under the weight of grocery bills and rent checks and utility costs that have not meaningfully declined, despite his bombastic insistence otherwise. The sheer audacity of this performance cannot be overstated because inflation hit 3% in September 2025 and has rebounded in recent months, returning to 3% after declining to 2.3% in April, which means the trajectory is objectively worsening, not improving, and this reversal coincides precisely with Trump's rollout of higher tariffs as U.S. importers deal with higher costs from import taxes by passing some of those costs on to consumers through higher prices. A completely foreseeable consequence that every single economist who wasn't on his payroll predicted would happen, and now we're watching the economic equivalent of an arsonist complaining about the smoke. The man who implemented inflationary policies stands before working people in Pennsylvania, declaring that their concerns about rising costs represent a con job perpetrated by his political opponents. And this inversion of reality would be comedically absurd if it weren't materially devastating to the people he's lying to. People for whom groceries have increased a lot according to 60% of voters, utilities by 78%, healthcare by 67%, housing by 66%, compared to a year ago. Let's parse the actual claim being made here, because the intellectual dishonesty operates on multiple registers simultaneously, and the transcript captures Trump attempting to articulate a position that fundamentally cannot withstand scrutiny, which is why his words dissolve into this recursive loop of blame and deflection. He asserts that Democrats created the problem of high prices and therefore they've forfeited the right to use the word affordability to describe that problem, as if language itself can be privatized and cordoned off based on culpability assessments, as if the material reality of not being able to afford rent somehow becomes illegitimate the moment someone he doesn't like acknowledges it exists. This is gaslighting as governing philosophy, the systematic attempt to convince people that their lived experience is fabricated, and it connects to a much longer conservative tradition of denying economic suffering whenever that denial serves their political interests, the same ideological lineage that gave us welfare queens and takers versus makers, and every other rhetorical weapon designed to delegitimize the material needs of working people by recasting those needs as moral failings or political conspiracies. And here's what makes this particularly insidious right now in December 2025. Because Democratic leaders Schumer and Jeffries watched inflation under Biden drag down their party in 2024, and now they're seizing on every negative inflation data point as proof that Trump isn't focused on Americans who are struggling, which means Democrats have actually learned something from their electoral catastrophe and recalibrated their messaging around the material conditions affecting voters, while Trump responds by declaring the entire issue fraudulent. He told the crowd that Democrats had used the term affordability as a hoax to hurt his reputation, which reframes the entire discourse around his personal grievances rather than the actual economic circumstances of American households. And this narcissistic centrifugal force is what always happens with authoritarian-adjacent leaders who cannot psychologically tolerate the existence of problems they haven't solved, so instead they deny the problems exist or they reconceptualize them as attacks orchestrated by enemies. The historical resonances here should alarm anyone with even a passing familiarity with how democracies decay, because when leaders begin systematically denying empirical reality and substituting their own narrative, particularly regarding economic conditions that people experience directly every single day, you're watching the epistemological foundations of democratic discourse disintegrate in real time. This isn't just spin or political exaggeration. Trump claimed he inherited the worst inflation in the history of our country, when the consumer price index under Biden peaked at 9.1% in June 2022, far from the worst the U.S. has experienced, which was 23.7% in June 1920, after World War I, or 14.8% in March 1980, Biden's, demonstrating that he's not simply exaggerating for effect, but constructing a parallel factual universe designed to justify his political positioning. When you combine demonstrably false historical claims with the Orwellian move of declaring that discussing affordability itself constitutes a hoax, you're witnessing something far more dangerous than typical political dishonesty. You're watching someone attempt to monopolize the terms of economic discourse itself by delegitimizing any frame that doesn't center his preferred narrative. But wait, because it gets even more revealing when you examine what Trump actually inherited versus what he claims. And this matters because Trump inherited a 3% inflation rate in January 2025, the same as the September 2025 rate he's now celebrating as evidence of his success, which means his entire argument about crushing inflation collapses under the weight of basic chronology. Consumer prices rose 3% year-over-year in September, well below 2022 levels when inflation hit 9.1%, but still higher than the Federal Reserve's 2% inflation target. So Trump is simultaneously taking credit for improvement that occurred before he took office, while declaring victory over a problem that objectively persists. And this double move, appropriating Biden's accomplishments while denying ongoing challenges, represents the quintessential Trumpian economic narrative, always and forever optimized for emotional resonance rather than factual accuracy. The class dynamics embedded in this performance deserve particular attention, because Trump delivered these remarks at a casino resort, standing before working people in a region where even Trump supporters like retired mechanic Lou Heddy noticed grocery bills rising from $175 to $200 in the past month alone, and expressed doubt that Trump can bring food prices down, saying once the prices get up for food, they don't ever come back down. And that quote from an actual Trump voter captures the material reality that no amount of rhetorical flourish can erase. Meanwhile, Democratic voter Suzanne Vena blames Trump's tariffs for making life more expensive, as she struggles with rising bills for food, rent, and electricity on a fixed income, remembering that Trump said he would stop inflation. On these testimonies from ordinary Pennsylvanians reveal the yawning chasm between Trump's triumphalist declarations and the lived experience of people trying to survive in this economy. The structural forces driving inflation matter here, because an October analysis by the Budget Lab at Yale found that current tariff policies are expected to cost each household an average of $1,800 in 2025, which represents a direct wealth transfer from working families to absorb the costs of Trump's trade policy, a regressive tax that falls hardest on those with the least capacity to bear it. And this is before we even get Trump's legislation that ended subsidies for the Affordable Care Act, sending insurance premiums skyrocketing, all because of his obsession with erasing Obama's legacy. So we're not talking about abstract economic forces or unforeseeable market dynamics. We're talking about specific policy choices this administration made that directly increased costs for ordinary people, and Trump's response is to declare that noticing these costs somehow constitutes a democratic scam. The border pivot in this clip is particularly telling, because Trump can't sustain focus on economic policy without veering into his obsessive nativist mythology, claiming that for 7 months we've had no people come through our border, which is itself a wild distortion, but more importantly it reveals the underlying authoritarian logic that connects all these threads together. When leaders cannot or will not address material problems, they redirect public anxiety toward scapegoated populations, they conjure external threats to explain internal failures, they offer nationalist mythology as substitute for economic policy, and this has been the playbook of right-wing authoritarianism since Mussolini, and it's playing out again, right now in a Pennsylvania casino where Trump oscillates between denying the affordability crisis exists and blaming Democrats for creating it, and then pivoting to immigration because that's the only narrative he knows how to tell, the only story that makes sense within his ideological universe. What makes this moment particularly dangerous for Democratic politics is how it inverts the proper relationship between leadership and accountability, because in a functioning democracy, leaders respond to material conditions identified by citizens, they craft policy to address documented problems, they stand for re-election based on outcomes rather than narratives. But Trump is attempting something categorically different. Polling shows 60% of respondents agreed Trump makes prices and inflation sound better than they really are, and nearly 2/3 said his policies are making grocery prices go up, which means a clear majority of Americans have diagnosed his rhetorical strategy and rejected it. Yet he persists because his political model depends not on persuading skeptics through evidence, but on maintaining the unwavering conviction of his base through constant reality denial and enemy construction. This is governance as extended propaganda campaign, policy as performance art, leadership as pure spectacle disconnected from measurable outcomes. Let's zoom out to the systemic implications, because individual instances of dishonesty matter less than the cumulative effect on democratic discourse itself. And when Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal calls Trump's dismissal of affordability as a hoax, patently out of touch, and says it speaks for itself, while questioning whether Trump learned anything from November's election results, is identifying the core pathology here, which is a president psychologically incapable of adjusting to negative feedback, institutionally unable to modulate his approach based on empirical outcomes, temperamentally allergic to the kind of responsive governance that democracy requires. And the Republican Party's response has been revelatory, because even Trump loyalist Marjorie Taylor Greene publicly acknowledged affordability is a real issue, and said it's one of the top issues not only in my district, it's across the country, prompting Trump to attack her on Truth Social, which demonstrates that even minimal deviation from his approved reality narrative triggers immediate punishment. The philosophical dimensions here connect to broader questions about truth and power in late capitalism, because what Trump is doing transcends ordinary political lying. He's attempting to exercise hegemonic control over the interpretive frameworks through which people understand their own material conditions. Antonio Gramsci wrote about cultural hegemony as the mechanism through which dominant classes maintain power, not through force alone, but by shaping the common sense assumptions that structure everyday life. And Trump's insistence that affordability concerns represent a hoax rather than legitimate economic anxiety represents an attempted hegemonic move, an effort to reconstruct the basic categories through which working people comprehend their own financial precarity. If he can convince people that their struggles aren't real, or that acknowledging those struggles constitutes disloyalty, or that the very vocabulary of economic hardship has been weaponized by his enemies, then he's fundamentally altered the terrain on which political contestation occurs. He's made it impossible to organize collective responses to shared problems because he's denied the problems exist in the first place. And the media's complicity in normalizing this cannot go unremarked, because the sensational headline, "Trump says Dems invented affordability hoax," treats this as one position in a legitimate debate rather than as an epistemic crisis threatening democratic functionality itself. The both sides framing, the view from nowhere journalism that presents Trump's reality denial and democratic concern about material conditions as somehow equivalent positions deserving equal consideration, this represents a catastrophic failure to distinguish between legitimate political disagreement and authoritarian gaslighting. And it's precisely this journalistic failure that enables figures like Trump to operate in the space between accountability and impunity, always able to claim they're just offering an alternative perspective while they systematically dismantle the shared factual foundation democratic politics requires. The economic data tells an unambiguous story, if you're willing to look, because grocery and rent costs are up 30% over the last 5 years. According to Bureau of Labor Statistics, economist Thomas Edsall calculated an estimated net loss of $2,250 in 2025 spending power for the median American household, before accounting for healthcare premium increases, which means working families are objectively worse off in measurable ways that compound daily. This isn't abstract economic theory or partisan point scoring. These are empirical reductions in purchasing power, material degradations in living standards, quantifiable transfers of wealth from labor to capital that show up in every grocery receipt and rent check and utility bill. And Trump's response to this documented immiseration is to declare the entire conceptual category fraudulent, to insist that Democrats invented the problem by naming it, as if economic precarity only exists to the extent that his political opponents acknowledge it. The through line connecting all of this is the conservative movement's fundamental hostility to collective provision and social solidarity, because the affordability crisis is ultimately a crisis of inequality and inadequate wages and privatized social goods. It's what happens when healthcare is a commodity, and housing is an investment vehicle, and education is a debt trap, and every basic human need gets filtered through profit-maximizing market logics. Conservatives cannot acknowledge this structural dimension without implicating the entire ideological framework they've spent decades constructing, so instead they deny the crisis exists, or they blame it on excessive government intervention, or they scapegoat immigrants and welfare recipients, anything to avoid confronting the reality that their political economy generates predictable patterns of deprivation and insecurity. Trump's hoax rhetoric represents the apotheosis of this denialism, the point where conservative ideology becomes so detached from material reality that it can only sustain itself through increasingly baroque reality denial and enemy construction. But here's what should terrify anyone paying attention. Because consumer confidence is near record lows and contrary to Trump's claims, most prices are not significantly down since he took office, with one Pennsylvania resident telling CNN how hard it is to stay afloat in the current economy. And when you combine collapsing consumer confidence with rising economic anxiety and a president who responds by delegitimizing those concerns as hoaxes, you're creating the conditions for democratic breakdown. People whose material needs go unmet don't simply accept their circumstances, they look for explanations. They demand accountability, they become available for political mobilization, and if the existing political system cannot or will not address their grievances through normal democratic channels, they become receptive to anti-democratic alternatives that promise order and scapegoats and simple solutions to complex problems. Trump is simultaneously generating economic instability through his tariff policies while denying that instability exists while blaming his opponents for inventing it. And this combination of policy failure plus rhetorical gaslighting plus scapegoating represents the classic authoritarian move, the exact sequence that transforms economic crisis into political crisis, into legitimacy crisis. The comparison to 2022 Biden is instructive, because in June 2022, with inflation at 9.1% year-on-year, Biden traveled to Philadelphia and said, "I've never been more optimistic about America than I am today," while claiming they'd made extraordinary progress. But voters knew life was more expensive, which is one reason Trump won on affordability in 2024, and now we're watching Trump make the exact same mistake, offering gauzy optimism and blame shifting while people experience ongoing financial strain. The difference is that Biden at least acknowledged the problem existed even while overstating his response, whereas Trump has moved to denying the problem's existence altogether, which represents an escalation in the detachment from reality, a doubling down on unreality as governing strategy. And the Democratic response has been to make affordability absolutely central to their 2026 strategy, because Schumer wants lawmakers to push legislation aimed at lowering costs in 4 areas: healthcare, housing, food and energy, tasking senators with forming working groups to drill into each policy area, which means Democrats are offering concrete policy remedies to documented problems, while Republicans are offering denial and deflection and demographic scapegoating. Let's be absolutely clear about what's at stake here, because among those who listed the economy and inflation as their top priorities, 77% said the president is not spending enough time on those issues. That represents a massive mandate for action that Trump is categorically refusing to honor, and this refusal connects to the broader conservative project of rendering government incapable of responding to collective needs. If you can convince people that government cannot solve problems, or that problems don't actually exist, or that only market forces can address social needs, then you've effectively neutralized the democratic demand for responsive governance. You've foreclosed the possibility of collective action through state power. You've made politics into pure culture war, an identity performance rather than material policymaking. This is the neoliberal endgame, the point where democratic states become so hollowed out and delegitimized that they can no longer fulfill even minimal social reproductive functions, and Trump's affordability hoax rhetoric advances that project by denying the legitimacy of state intervention to address economic precarity. The visceral disgust you should feel watching this clip stems from the brazenness of it all, because Trump isn't even bothering with sophisticated deception. He's just asserting things that are demonstrably false and daring anyone to challenge him, banking on the fact that his supporters will accept his framing regardless of evidence, and his opponents lack the media apparatus to effectively counter his narrative. Trump immediately declared people's economic concerns are a hoax and falsely asserted prices are coming down, but he also lashed out Ebenezer Scrooge style at working Americans who want to spoil their kids for the holidays, telling them they don't need multiple dolls or pencils, which reveals the contempt underlying his entire economic worldview, the belief that ordinary people's desires for even modest material comfort represent excess and indulgence rather than reasonable aspirations. This is plutocratic morality presented as common sense, the notion that working people should accept austerity and diminished expectations while the wealthy accumulate without limit, and it's particularly galling coming from a man whose entire aesthetic involves gold-plated everything and whose policy agenda centers on permanent tax cuts for the ultra-rich. The systemic critique we need to be making here is that Trump's individual mendacity matters less than the structural conditions that enable it, because he's operating within a political economy that has spent 40 years transferring wealth upward, suppressing wages, privatizing public goods, and financializing every aspect of social life, and the affordability crisis represents the inevitable culmination of those policy choices. You cannot have stagnant wages plus rising costs plus privatized healthcare, plus financialized housing, plus student debt, plus eroding social insurance, and then act surprised when people cannot afford their lives. This didn't happen by accident or because Democrats talked about it. This happened because of deliberate policy choices made over decades to prioritize capital accumulation over human welfare, to treat labor as a cost to be minimized rather than people to be sustained, to subordinate all social relations to market logics. Trump's hoax rhetoric obscures this structural dimension by personalizing and politicizing what is ultimately a systemic crisis generated by class war waged from above, and the stakes for 2026 could not be higher, because in November elections, voters in New Jersey, Virginia, and New York City elected Democrats as they voiced concerns about cost of living and turned up heat on Trump, which demonstrates that when Democrats center economic justice and material needs in their campaigns, they win, even in off-cycle elections where Trump's party usually dominates. The midterms represent a potential inflection point, where either the affordability crisis becomes the basis for Democratic resurgence and progressive policymaking, or Trump successfully convinces enough people that their struggles are imaginary and consolidates authoritarian control. The choice is between a politics grounded in material reality and collective provision versus a politics based on reality denial and scapegoating, between democracy responsive to popular needs versus autocracy disconnected from empirical accountability. What progressives must understand is that this fight is fundamentally about the relationship between truth and power, about whether factual reality constrains political discourse or whether raw power can construct alternative realities impervious to evidence. Every time Trump declares affordability a hoax and faces no meaningful consequences, every time his supporters accept his framing despite their own financial struggles, every time media treats his claims as legitimate positions rather than dangerous gaslighting, the space for democratic politics shrinks a little further. We're fighting for the preservation of a shared empirical foundation on which democratic contestation can occur, for the principle that leadership requires responsiveness to measurable outcomes, for the basic democratic proposition that government should address rather than deny the material needs of citizens. This clip captures Trump's authoritarian impulse in miniature, the reflexive denial of inconvenient reality, the projection of failure onto opponents, the appeal to resentment and fear instead of solutions, and recognizing it for what it is represents the first step toward organizing the collective resistance this moment demands. The fury you feel watching this should be channeled toward systemic transformation, because individual outrage about Trump's dishonesty accomplishes nothing without organizational infrastructure to translate that outrage into political power. We need movements that connect economic justice to democratic renewal, that articulate why the affordability crisis stems from structural inequality rather than partisan incompetence, that offer concrete policy alternatives rather than simply criticizing Trump's denial. We need labor organizing that rebuilds working-class power, tenant organizing that challenges housing financialization, healthcare organizing that demands universal provision, all connected through an explicit democratic socialist framework that names capitalism as the source of deprivation and state power as the necessary tool for collective provision. Trump's hoax rhetoric should radicalize us toward demanding fundamental restructuring rather than minor adjustments, toward recognizing that a political economy generating mass precarity while producing unprecedented wealth concentration requires not reform but transformation. This is the fight of our generation, because what we're witnessing isn't just partisan competition, but the potential unraveling of democratic governance itself, and the outcome depends on whether movements for economic justice can build sufficient power to overcome entrenched corporate interests and authoritarian impulses. Trump's affordability hoax represents everything wrong with contemporary conservatism: the reality denial, the cruelty, the subordination of human welfare to political performance, the systematic gaslighting of people experiencing genuine suffering, and defeating this requires not just winning elections, but transforming the structural conditions that make such figures possible in the first place. Every person struggling with rent should be organizing with their neighbors. Every worker squeezed by stagnant wages should be unionizing their workplace. Every parent unable to afford childcare should be demanding universal provision, and all these struggles must connect through an explicit politics of democratic socialism that offers systemic alternatives rather than incremental adjustments. The man in that clip is lying to your face about your own life. The question is what you're going to do about it.